Here I have both my latest Raspberry Pi and my first Raspberry Pi. This is a pretty exciting thing to look at the two side by side because, well, one, Raspberry Pi Model 3B Plus is so popular that we all know what a Raspberry Pi is by this point, but at the time that the Raspberry Pi original Model B came out, it was one of those things that, it was exciting. You had to tell people what a Raspberry Pi was. They couldn't believe this idea of a computer that fit in the palm of your hand. And we told them it was $35, it made it even more astounding. And here we have the two pieces of sort of the Raspberry Pi lineage side by side, and you can see how drastically different they really are. The 3B Plus just is a stunning piece of hardware, and I absolutely love this sort of embossed raspberry on top here. And when you look at it, you got 4 USB ports, and of course we have our video outputs here, HDMI, and then this one's the 3.5 that can output to an older style television. And then here we have our GPIO pins. And when you take a look, the original Raspberry Pi had very similar connections. HDMI out, video out over here, and 2 USB ports. But we still had GPIO pins, just a lot fewer of them. And really, it was only this first release that only had 26 pins. In fact, once we moved on to the B Plus, we were able to get the full 40 pin that we know today. And that 40 pin makes a big difference. Having those extra pins really helps out. But again, an exciting opportunity to look at these two pieces of hardware side by side. And while we're at it, why not take a look at the full lineup of the Raspberry Pi from the B all the way to the 3B Plus. Here you can see the whole lineup from the original Pi Model B to the modern Pi 3B Plus. Now you may be wondering why the letter B. Turns out there is in fact a Model A. I just have never bought one. It did have a little less specs than the Model B, but there is in fact a Model A, just not shown here. Starting with the original Pi Model B on the left, we then went to the B Plus. This is where we jumped from 26 to 40 pins. The Pi 2 then arrived after that, and then the Pi 3 arrived with some great upgrades. This is where we got built-in Wi-Fi and built-in Bluetooth. And then the Pi 3B Plus gained actually dual-band Wi-Fi, both 2.4 and 5.0 gigahertz. Now, one of the interesting things about the Pi is when you actually look at what's on the board. It turns out that your built-in Wi-Fi is hidden underneath this little embossed raspberry. Your CPU, GPU, and RAM are all inside of this system on a chip. And over here, a lot of times people think like, oh, if that's CPU, that must be where a GPU is. Over here is not the GPU. This is actually what controls the USB ports and the Ethernet port over here. You can actually see the little traces where they connect. But that gives you an idea of what kind of pieces are on top of this board. And pretty much every single Raspberry Pi you can see has HDMI out, USB ports, maybe fewer of them in older models. But there's always a video output. There's always the ability to attach peripherals. There's always power through a micro USB. But one of the other interesting things, if you start flipping them over, is you'll notice there's mainly a micro SD card slot for your hard drive on all of these Pis, except for a full-size SD card slot on the original Pi Model B. Now that I've actually loaded SD cards inside of these, you can see what a significant difference it was to jump from a full-size SD card to the micro SD card. And considering that many of us were just using a full-size SD card adapter for a micro SD card, it certainly helped to just switch to an actual micro SD card slot. So there you have it. Those are pretty much the features of the Pi Model B up to the Pi Model 3B Plus. But wait, there's one more interesting piece of the Raspberry Pi family. When talking about different variations of the Raspberry Pi hardware, it's always important to include the Raspberry Pi Zero. Here I have 2 Pi Zeros. These are the 0W, which simply means built-in Wi-Fi, and you can see that they're a much smaller form factor. They're very thin. If you turn them on their side, you can see that the USB ports have been reduced, and you can also see that the HDMI has been compressed as well. You can get adapters so that you can interface with the micro USB and the HDMI mini, but basically this is not intended to work like your standard Raspberry Pi. These are a great leave-in a project kind of Raspberry Pi. That's why it's such a tight form factor. To show you size comparison to your regular Raspberry Pi, you can see that the Pi Zero is significantly smaller. Now when you do have headers attached, they are of course the same height, but the rest of the board is much thinner. Here we'll take a look at the one without headers, and that thinness of the Pi Zero is very noticeable. It's a great piece of hardware for specific applications, so it's not necessarily what you would use if you're just looking to get started with a Raspberry Pi, in which case you would want the standard Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi has come in a lot of great models over the years, and today we have the Raspberry Pi Model 3B Plus. What's next for the Raspberry Pi Foundation? Who knows, but I'm sure that it'll be another great piece to add to the Raspberry Pi family. Thank you for watching.